Father came home that night to see a race car in the garage. He asked my dad what it was doing there, and he said, "That's a race car, and I'm going to be a race driver." And my granddad said, "Well, and some of you may have heard this story because this is apocryphal, you might say. It's something that is ingrained in our family and in my children too." My grandpa said, "Well, son, that's good. All you have to do is go back inside, pack up all your bags, kiss your mom goodbye, change your name, and you can do anything you want to do after that." That's really a true story. And I heard that so many times as I was growing up that I knew I didn't have to get the full story from him, and my children as well. But it's changed, interestingly, and that comes back to what we're talking about with safety and what I've seen. What Jim Downing and Hubbard have done with the Hans device, what the Indianapolis Motor Speedway has done with the safety barriers, those things have changed the face of racing. And I think with the speeds that have increased over the years, I think without those safety features, we would be looking at a much different landscape, you might say, of our sport, because fatalities are not what obviously any of us would ever want to see. And I think that the advent of those improvements that we have seen, helmets and other things, fire suppression and fire safety, that I think that we have made a major step forward. So, and that ties back to why my grandfather said to my dad, in those days, back in, especially on the West Coast in Los Angeles, with one of the original Ascots, which is a dirt track there in Los Angeles, honestly, there were, and this is back in the 20s and 30s, and just into the 40s, there were at many times 2 or 3 fatalities on a weekend. Several, obviously several during a season. Something that we could never stand at this point, but it's something that has improved so much and is so heartening that I see that that's something that we all need to be aware of.
One of the things that I can say for certain, your dad had a great eye for talent, and I think there must be a DNA strand for recognizing talent, because you've had that same ability to sort of understand, okay, this guy is going to be super. What is it about what you see in a race car driver your dad saw that can take someone from a jalopy to an Indy 500?
Well, I don't think it's anything really special, although I've done that all my life in our management company. That's what we have to do, is find young talent that's coming up. But there's a lot of people that can recognize good drivers. I'll give you one example, because he's sitting in front of me, and it's Herb Fischel. Because interestingly, Jeff Gordon, who had come to me and was in a contract with another manufacturer, his stepdad, his name is John Bickford, had asked that we represent him. Jeff was a young man of 14 years old beating adults out in California, and that wasn't hard to recognize. Just as it wasn't hard to recognize Kyle Larson recently, or Tony Stewart before that, and a number of other drivers, obviously. But interestingly, Jeff came to race at our track because he was underage. We told him that he was too young, couldn't sign the release, and he went down to Florida and raced for a few years where they used to let you do anything you wanted. But now that's changed, of course. But in any event, Jeff came back to California, made his name then in the midgets, and then decided that he wanted to be in IndyCar racing. They really didn't know him very well there, so his stepdad took him down south. The interesting part of the story is that, so Jeff came, or John Bickford came to me and asked me to help him negotiate his contracts, first with Bill Davis in that Baby Ruth car, and then eventually, of course, with Rick Hendrick. And so when I spoke with, so they called me, I started talking with Rick Hendrick about Jeff, and we started talking about a contract because Jeff was able to opt out of his contract with Bill Davis. And I guess I'd say Ford too. Sam Scott's in here somewhere and probably is still upset about that. But in any event, I didn't know this until years and years later. So when we started negotiating the contract, each time they'd make an offer for Jeff, and he'd only run just a few races, of course, but Hendrick saw him and knew that there was something special with Jeff. So what I'd call back and we'd talk a little while, and they'd up the offer. I wouldn't even ask for more; they just upped the offer. We kept doing that, and finally, one of the final, I just went, and each time I'd tell Bickford, and they'd say, "Take the money. That's more than we've ever believed we'd ever make in our lifetime." And so I called Hendrick back, and I still kind of hee-hawed around a little bit. I said, "Well, I'm not so sure." And he said, "Well, we'll make sure you have a Chevy dealership too." So I walked away thinking I was probably the greatest negotiator in history. Until years later, when I found out, when I spoke with Rick Hendrick, he said, "Well, you know, every time you called me, I got Herb Fischel and General Motors on the phone, and they said, go ahead and up the offer." So it was pretty easy. And we did, actually it's interesting because we did the same thing with Jimmy Johnson, and although we didn't represent Jimmy, Herb recognized that talent. Jimmy came into my office and spoke with me a long time about being represented, but he was already on his way with GM. But we've seen special kids come along, and I saw that with Tony Stewart. Our family still promotes races, and so I see them, and I go to several short track and dirt tracks across the country, and you can see somebody that stands out. There's a lot of really good race drivers, but there's just a few great race drivers, and Jeff, of course, fits in that. And I think I don't have to give you a tip now, because Kyle Larson is, and we said it for a few years ago, and we signed him to a contract right away. So he's a rising star. There isn't any question about it.
What is it about dirt track racing that so many of these great guys in NASCAR or other forms of racing, and you can go all the way back to AJ Foyt, for that matter, why is dirt racing such a great development tool for pavement racers, especially in the major leagues?
Well, I think the car control is a big factor. There isn't any question, but really, growing up on pavement too, I don't think is a disadvantage, because obviously there's a lot of pavement racers that are winning championships, and so I think though the one thing with dirt is that you do learn to not only the car control, but a lot of the back and forth and the bumping and pushing around that you don't get as much on the pavement. But I think overall, you know, it's, when you think about the changes years and years ago, I looked at the Indy 500 and the statistics back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and I saw probably an average of 25 of the 33 starters all had raced actually at our track, Ascot, out in California, and obviously a number of other short tracks and dirt tracks across the country. And then they go to Indianapolis and do extremely well as well. They just took to the pavement. So, I think I'm still a major advocate of racing on dirt because that's I guess in my DNA. But I think that the combination, I thought it was very interesting when we went to Eldora the last few years in the truck races. The pavement racers got on dirt and actually performed as well as some of the dirt racers that get on pavement for the first time too. So I think a great race driver is a great race driver no matter what surface he's on.
You mentioned Indianapolis. It's fitting we're here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and you told me a story about how you might not be here today as our keynote speaker if it wasn't for sort of a chance occurrence for your dad.
Yeah, that's an interesting story because a couple of things happened in our family life that that is the reason that I'm sitting here, I guess. One of them, of course, was the story I just told you about my grandfather and my father's repartee. I guess my dad could have said, well, I'm going to be a race driver, and walked out. Of course, he didn't have the money to be a race driver. And by the way, the part of that story is my dad decided not to kiss his mom goodbye. He stayed home, and my grandpa's promise to him was that he would support him in helping him sponsor and run his race cars if he went out and found a driver who was brave enough, I guess, to go out and risk what was happening before we had all these safety devices. But in any event, in 1947, actually in the late 30s, my dad went through, as well as owning race cars, promoting racing, running sanctioning groups and all the rest of it. And he was operating one of the largest sanctioning bodies on the West Coast for sprint cars. But after the war, as everybody knows, Indianapolis Motor Speedway had closed down for several years. When they reopened, my dad got in his car because he was just coming into his own. He was in his late 20s, early 30s, and drove back here to Indianapolis, came back to the back gate to obtain a credential so that he could come into the races and see what was happening, because everybody knew Indianapolis was where you had to be if you were a race car owner or a promoter or anything in the business. He walked to the back gate, they looked at him and they knew who he was, and they said, well, you're not allowed in here. And my dad said, well, why not? He said, well, you're the president of WRA, which was Western Racing Association, and this is AAA, and we don't allow anybody from any other sanctioning groups inside this racetrack. This is a true story. This was before they started enforcing a lot of the antitrust acts and some of that. My dad was devastated, but actually turned around to get back in his car and drive all the way back to Los Angeles. A buddy of his stopped him and said, well, what's wrong? Why are you leaving? And he told him. And this guy said, well, here's an extra badge that I have. You can sneak in and look around or whatever. For some reason, and so my dad did that. For some reason, they either never caught him or whatever, and he luckily stayed in because, again, I wouldn't be sitting here. He walked around and saw a lot of his friends, saw a lot of the people that he wanted to be with, and he did get in his car after the race, went back to LA. As soon as he got back to LA, he ordered a brand new Curtis Craft race car, an brand new Offie engine, and got ready, started getting ready for the next May. When he entered his car for the coming May race, he had to enter it, and this is interesting. So the first year that my dad's car was entered in the Indy 500, which was 1948, it was red and white, red flames, 98 on it. It it's something that a lot of people recognize, but the official, the AAA official in Los Angeles, who was a good friend of my dad's, said, well, you're going to have to do two things, not three like my grandfather said, but two things. One, you're going to have to enter your car under somebody else's name, or they're never going to accept it. So he named it after his claysmith, who was his mechanic, and the assistant mechanic, Danny Jones. So it was a Smith and Jones special, which appeared to be a phony name, but it was true actually. But they put the 98 on it, and then the other thing that he had to do was give up his membership in the presidency of the sanctioning group in California, which then folded a few years later, within the next year, to show the power of what was happening then under AAA. Now they don't do that anymore, but in any event, that's what happened. So my dad then came back to Indianapolis the next year with Johnny Mance with the 98 car, and they continued on. Within 4 years, 1952, he won the 500 with Troy Ruttman, and then in 1963, with the car that you listened to with your dad on the radio, in 1963 with Parnelli Jones. We had a third involvement, Mike Kerb and I, of course, with Brian Herta and Dan Weldon in 2011, and that was a 98 as well. One other quick thing, if I can go on about those cars. Each one of those cars had a little pig on the side of it, and that was our family, one of our family businesses. We were in the refuse collection and hog raising and that type of thing. In fact, my dad would love it here. If he was here, he'd say, well, that's all used food here, and we're going to feed that to our pigs. So on the side of our car, we used to call it the used food special. And that's what financed those cars for years and years, of course. But a good luck charm was always the pig that was on the side of the car. And so we had that in the 1952 car, and then in 1963, we had that on the car with Parnelli Jones. In 2011, when Dan Weldon was getting in the car at Indianapolis, I had a little decal, and Brian Herta says, do you have that the pig decal? And I said, yeah, I sure do. And we both together leaned over and put it right on the little bulge where the transmitter was, and stuck that little pig on there, and that's what crossed the finish line first. So but there's a lot of great memories from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and my dad loved the place, and so do I.
And my dad told me not to drive like Parnelli Jones, so there's the connection right there. Does anyone have a question for Cary? You'll have to belt it out without a microphone, but does anybody have a question? Because I've got plenty if you don't. That'll warn you. Go ahead.
How come more short tracks don't have buses in the stands?
Yeah, yes. Russ Dean wants to know why there aren't more buses in the grandstand, which doesn't make any sense to anybody but him, because when he used to come out to Ascot, we had a London bus down in the first turn without a top on it, and it became a place for all the in people to be able to go down there and watch the races from the first turn. It was high enough where you didn't get hit with the dirt too much, but you could look down on the cars backing in the corner. So I don't know why nobody else picked that up, but that was something that we prided ourselves on at Ascot.
Great question. What IndyCar driver do you wish had driven the 98?
Well, that's a good question. You know, a lot of the great drivers actually drove my dad's cars during those years. Tony Bettenhausen, for one, in 1955. Bill Vukovich Sr., who was probably one of the greatest ever at Indianapolis, drove my dad's car at a Champ Car race, not at Indy, but in a Champ Car race. So we saw a lot of great drivers driving his car in those days. I don't know. There's so many, and in today's group of young drivers, I I put Kyle Larson in the car today.
Great answer there. Okay, we all here have heard of Kyle Larson by now, but who are the next young guys that you've spotted that are going to be making a lot of noise here in the next couple of years? I know I have one personal favorite.
Well, I can't give you all my tips because they're not all signed. But actually, there's a couple of young kids. It's interesting because just last week at Thanksgiving, or a few weeks ago, at Thanksgiving out in Paris, California, our family promoted the Thanksgiving night Grand Prix. That's a midget race on a half-mile track. Our family's been promoting that since 1955. Not that long. It started in 1934, so it almost rivals Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But the Grand Prix on Thanksgiving night is something that our family's been involved with. My dad actually restarted it because it stopped in the late or the early 50s, and then he started promoting it again, and we have promoted that continuously from 55. So I could tell you where I have been since 1955, every Thanksgiving night since that time. And I always thought, of course, that Thanksgiving turkey was on Friday night, not on Thursday, because we ate hot dogs on Thursday night. But in any event, what happened on that night, a young man named Christopher Bell won. But following behind him, and he's also a client, and he is one of the next best things. He's been driving midgets the last few years, but has just started in stock cars and has already won a pavement race. And he'd never really been on pavement before. So when I said a great driver is a great driver, that's what happens. But more interesting than that, I think, is the person that finished in the top 10 and walked up the midget championship, National Midget Championship, is a fellow named Rico Abreu. And you will hear his name in the coming years, not only because of his great talent, but he's a little person, 4'6", a tremendous talent. I watched him race in a midget a few years ago and never realized aspect of guy or whatever, and he won the national championship. So at our race, we crowned Rico Abreu as the national midget champion, and hopefully this next year he'll be getting some opportunities in stock cars, as well as Christopher Bell. So those are a couple of them. There's a whole bunch more. So.
We've had Rico on our dirt show already, on our Sling and Mud dirt show, and Christopher Bell was just on our Inside Pass show that we do for the Pro All-Star Series, because that kid was like his second or third pavement race ever and won out at Hickory. So, he's a big talent. Okay, I got to ask you the final question here before we wrap up and head back into the other room. What is it about drivers when they put the helmet on? Because some of these guys are the nicest guys in the world, but they strap that helmet on and all of a sudden they lose their minds.
Well, I'm not a driver, so I can't explain that exactly, but that is true.
The driver.
No question about it. And yeah, when they put their helmet on, it disconnects their brain, as they say. But drivers are a very fascinating group of people, and I've dealt with them obviously all of my life because we've been in that business since I was born. I've never. People ask me, "Do you really like racing?" And I laugh because I don't know any different. I was born almost at a racetrack, but my mom was pregnant in the grandstands with me, so it's just a part of my, as I say, my DNA. But drivers, I've just found are to be really interesting people because and I know Lynn St. James is looking at me. I don't see any other drivers around here. I don't think that I'm insulting. And she didn't lose her mind when she put her helmet on. She's one of the smarter drivers. But in any event, I just I admire them not only for their bravery and their talent, but especially the new group of young drivers that are coming along. They understand business. They understand what they need to do for the future as well, and they listen. We pride ourselves in managing drivers to make sure that when they retire, they can retire properly. And that, if I could take one more moment, that's what to some extent got me into the management side of my business. Troy Ruttman, who I mentioned earlier, won the Indy 500 in my dad's car. He was 22 years old, still to this day the youngest driver to ever win the 500. He was a wonderful guy, great guy, but he went out and spent all of his money, wouldn't listen to anybody, and when he died, he didn't have a lot. Parnelli Jones came around 11 years later. I admired and looked up to Troy Ruttman. He came to my dad the same way that Troy did when they were young guys racing in Southern California. And my dad said, look, this is what's happened to Troy. You have to listen, and we're going to invest your money. Every time you win a race, we'll go out and buy some property out in Southern California. Parnelli was from LA as well. Actually born in Arkansas, but raised in California, and so they did that. And to this day, Parnelli is, I'd say, probably the most prosperous of all the retired drivers that I know. And it proved something to me to watch that, and I guess I just learned that really from my dad. But I was able to mix then the fact that I'm an attorney. It made it even easier to assist the drivers in their contracts and that type of thing. So that's kind of how I got into that. Well, before you finish, I wanted to commend Tim and Margot Frost for doing what they've done here. This is an esteemed group of people, and I really mean that. And the panels and speakers are fantastic. This is a great benefit to the motorsports industry, what we all do and love. Continues to educate us. I look forward to it each year, and it gets better and better, and I think is a very important factor in our industry. So I want to commend both of them, although I know Margot works much harder than Tim does. A lot of people don't know that, but I know that. And so in any event, but I've enjoyed being here, and it's really great to see so many old friends here, and I hope that I hope you all learn just as I am.